Up next is Devin Gallucci. Please welcome her.
Hi there. My name is Devin Gallucci. I go by she, her. I'm from Burlington, Vermont, which I'd like to acknowledge is the occupied land of the Abenaki people. I received my BFA in creative media from Champlain College. I can't decide if my favorite movie is The Exorcist 3 or Paddington 2, and I make comic arts. So the suggestion, it's not enforced, but the suggestion for how to make the most of your time here at MCAD is to, in your first year, go wide, try lots of stuff, and in your second year, go down, like refine, focus in. But I felt like I had done a lot of experimenting and trying new things in my undergrad and the year since then, a lot of starting stuff and not necessarily finishing it. So I wanted to come in year one, day one, with a specific project goal in mind. The idea for this project came from somewhat randomly stumbling across a mythological figure named Attis, who was a Phrygian deity. Who there's many different tellings of all sorts of different versions as it spread throughout Asia and Europe, but the gist of it usually involves around castrating himself in a fit of madness and then being resurrected as a pine tree by either Zeus or the Bagna Mater fertility goddess that he's a consort of, which is cool. There's some interesting visuals going on there. But what I found particularly evocative and interesting was that this mythology inspired a real-world cult of religious followers who would ritually castrate themselves, live as a woman, and don a sort of proto-drag queen exaggerated femininity. And it felt really, really interesting and empowering to sort of randomly stumble across this little nugget of queer history that I had never heard of before that went back as far as 300 BCE and, spread all throughout Asia and Europe. So I really wanted to incorporate something with that myth. Another thing that was a really big influence for me at the time, and still is for sure, is the post-punk, lots of other adjectives album, Death Consciousness by Have a Nice Life, which is a very immersive, moody, cold, sort of take on longing for death and mental anguish that has really resonated with me over the years. Also, another lens for how I chose to brainstorm on this project was the Dantean finding yourself within a forest dark midway through the journey of your life imagery, especially the illustrations by Gustave Doré from the late 19th century. Also delving a little bit into the beginnings of the modern history of transness. And then also with a little bow of folk horror. For those who are unfamiliar, I really like this little write-up by Michelle Nijus in her article on folk horror. In folk horror, the threat usually comes from the depths of the past or the depths of the earth, from buried atrocities, suppressed beliefs, or even the land itself. And there's a little slide from The Witch, which is probably my favorite folk horror movie. So bundling that all together, throwing in some extra spices of other things that have influenced me from the beginning and through the process. Kind of smushing it all together. And then we have Addis, a trans folk horror. Addis follows three characters, Miles, Cameron, and Ben, as they wander through a seemingly never-ending pine forest. Hopes are low, they haven't found food in months, they don't really understand how they're surviving. The more and more they discover, they come to the realization that there is no way out of the pine forest, and the only way to metaphorically escape is to turn inwards. There is a reason it's called a trans folk horror. About a third of the way through the story, they trans their gender, and Miles, Ben, and Cameron become Mela, Beatrix, and Karanin. Here are some thumbnail sketches of the upcoming chapters. Let's see. So for basically the first time in their lives, things start to go good. But the lingering horror and violence of the Pine sticks with them, manifesting in the form of Mela's depression and isolation, Bia's anxiety and restlessness, feeling like she can never truly find a place to call home, and Karenan's bodily dysphoria. Through a series of personal tragedies and other discoveries, we, the reader, and the characters learn that every single pine tree in the forest is the corpse of a fallen trans person. Thematically, Addis is about isolation, trauma, violence, the history of transphobia, and how that experience lingers with trans people, pushing us to outskirts that are both externally forced upon us, but also internally enforced by demons we've sort of sucked into our being. But it's still possible to find one another, create community, and make the queer life a holistically livable one. So I started thumbnailing this project out September of last year, 2023. My rough plan was to have something like 200 to 250 pages, around 13 or so chapters. In storyboarding the whole thing out and also beginning to illustrate the thing, I've now drawn, as of last night actually, 157 pages and have approximately 670 pages planned, which means that this will probably take a year and a half to 2 years after graduation to complete. Oops, my MCAD project that I was going to finish within my entire time here is no longer my MCAD project, but I'm really excited, honestly. I'm really excited for the future of this and it, transforming me into a prolific comic artist person. So the way I go about making a comics page is I begin with measuring things out, making sketches in non-photo blue pencil, and then beginning the inking with either a Pilot G-Tech, which is a really fine but kind of dynamic technical pen that I'm a big fan of, or Japanese dip pens. I'm a really big fan of the Maru dip pen. It's very fine, but also like super bold. Then we go in with making corrections with either white gouache, white Posca markers, or something that a cohort just turned me on to, Presto Whiteout, which is super good. It's like the strongest chemical smell I've ever used with anything, but it's really great. And then texturing with really dry brushes or ink splashes to create a really crackly lived-in texture, especially for the backgrounds. And then probably the most idiosyncratic part of my workflow is using custom screen tone, both to call towards the aesthetic influence of manga on my work, because screen tone is used very heavily in manga, but also to kind of push some of those crunchy textures a little farther. Let's see here. So while working on Addis, I came to the realization that it is an act of reckoning with my otherness, incorporating difficult themes and subject matter to communicate that. Effectively, my little artistic version of trying to be seen. To quote my beloved Death Consciousness that influenced me so, I've got a message that I must relay. No, I can't delay it one more day. It's not going well. It is desperate. Can you relate? Can you please relate? I'm not holding up. While creating thumbnails last fall, I started having a very bodily response. I would wake up with something between indigestion and a panic attack and not really understand what was going on. Certain parts of the story, I would like start bawling, like bite my thumb to stop myself from doing that. Showing the thumbnails off to my roommates, I thought I was gonna like throw up at one point. And this distress was pretty out of character for me. I've found comfort in somewhat depressing or distressing subject matter for a very long time, and working on this project wasn't just simply making me feel better, and that was very confusing. So real quick, I would like to read an excerpt from my position paper going into this. My experiences with transphobia have basically never begun with blatant hatred. The threshold for evidence of my otherness feels unreachable. It feels as if there's nothing short of blood or bruises that will elicit sympathy. Weird looks for using the women's room don't count. Eye rolls when you speak don't count. Laughing that stops abruptly when you enter a room doesn't count. It's even more confusing when the invisible tension doesn't start right away. At first, my presence might even be novel, kinda cute, like seeing a weird bird in the woods you don't recognize. The more I make my presence known, the more I take up space in the same way cis feminists pat themselves on the back for, the more art I make about this very subject, the more putrid my presence becomes. I am an invasive species. Turning these messy thoughts into visual abstraction and surreal fantasy is like the only way to communicate them with any efficacy. My relationship to art on this subject matter is becoming really complicated. This project to make my otherness visible has the power to other me a lot quicker, and it's brought up feelings that I've never felt so intensely before. I'm not a psychiatrist, so this should probably be taken with a grain of salt, but I've come to realize that working on this story wasn't necessarily an easy outlet for my turbulent inner feelings. Addis has been an exorcism. I thought that my art practice would be a simple outward release of pent-up emotion, but that emotion seems to have cycled in and out of me through the process, like an Ouroboros tied in a pretzel knot, a cycle of living, coping, and reliving. I think overall this is a therapeutic process, however painful. Making art about this feels like the only thing I can do. So, tying in with the story, life can be terrifying, absurd, and cruel. You might feel like you've been discarded to a never-ending pine forest. But there's also hope and beauty in ephemera. Love, friends, art, and nature are worth living for. Even in pine barrens that want you dead, you can find gardens that welcome you. Then I would, to close things off, I would like to thank my mentors, John Bivens and Blue Delaquanti, my thesis committee, Caitlin Skalrud and Jacob Yates, the MFA director, Sarah Peterson, and all the folks involved with the MFA program. I'd also like to thank my mom for working very hard to support me and my siblings, my dad for fostering a lot of creative ambition, and my grandma for always getting me paper to draw on when I was little. My friend Jess, who I met in undergrad, and my wife Jamie, who's here with me. Any questions? Hi, Roos.
I am very aware that Berserk is one of your favorite manga, and so it is mine. And the aesthetic and the drawings of it, I feel like, is quite similar approach that you take for your manga as well. How much do you think Berserk aesthetic has inspired you for this?
A ton. Thank you for pointing that out. Yeah, that is a very big influence on my work, and the sort of from the essence of the story of kind of going to some of the like darkest places a story can go, but also exploring the like light at the end of the tunnel. But also, I so very much admire Kentaro Miura's uh, dedication to the craft in a way that I don't think I could ever replicate, because I think I come at it from a much more sketchy, messy, visceral place than his like incredibly uber polished work. Um, but that like combination of like shoujo manga inspired beauty and joy, but also like dread and horror is like a super big influence on me. Maddie.
Um, do you have plans to disseminate this out into the world when it's finished, or is it kind of like a private um, project that you've made?
Yeah, no, I definitely my I I like to like pat myself in the back and be like, I'm like anti-capitalist. I don't stand for you know, entrepreneurial bullshit or whatever, but I'm also like, I really want it in Barnes and Noble. I don't know how to navigate those feelings. But yeah, I would love to have it published, either by like a really big publisher, like First Second or Fantagraphics, or like maybe something a little bit more niche and indie, like Silver Sprocket or Uncivilized would be awesome. Yeah, even very personal stuff, I tend to have this feeling of like, if I don't share it with people, why did I even make it? Which is maybe like a strangely immature thought. But thank you for asking. Elizabeth.
I know you've been sharing it at like zine events and readings, and how's that affected your process? Because I've been there, and people really resonate, you know.
Thank you. Yeah, it's It's well, on the one hand, it's been very like humbling and positive to see people really excited about it. And then also, it's been interesting to see what people gravitate towards. Like the screen tone, for instance. Let me go back to that. Um, was something I did to kind of just avoid paying for the very, very expensive real deal Japanese deleter screen tone. And I thought it was like kind of bootleg or like shoddy, but like happy with my little strange workflow and workaround. But people seem to really resonate with it. Like when I've showed off the pages, to a degree where I've tried to use that technique as much as possible. Yeah.
There's another question.
Miranda.
So did you have the whole story planned out when you first started, or do you feel like it's changed at all as you've been working on it?
Oh yeah. There, the sort of beginning, middle, end has been pretty stable, but I'd say the story has evolved a lot. Something I write a little bit about in my position paper is this sort of appreciation for the project taking its time in a way that I don't feel like I necessarily was to begin with. Like I wanted to like get this done as quickly as possible, but then being forced to, slow down and draw the thing and also ideate on the story and just like live life has like essentially like forced me to like reflect on it and like let it grow organically in a way that I'm really happy for. Yeah.
I know you mentioned the album Death Consciousness, and I saw something. I know your music is a big influence on like your work and like your workflow. How exactly do you find that have played into coming up with the story for Alice?
I think it's informed by like kind of like two pathways, either very ekphrastically and viscerally, sort of just like the vibe of a certain piece of music that I really appreciate for whatever reason, abstractly informing the feeling that I'm trying to evoke. Then there's been other times where like very specifically lyrics are involved, especially from the album Death Consciousness. I could name other pieces of music, but I would be here forever. That have very directly I've tried to draw from almost like poetry, which I've also like I've debated on how transparent I should be, because like I don't know if it's like tacky and weird to be like this was inspired by this song or whatever. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Devin. Really.